Well, something a little different involving the Big Boys Westward Bound tour. Today they're in Sparks. Yesterday they ran the train up over Donner Summit between Roseville and Sparks. So the unusual thing is that yesterday, as they were coming up at the very base of Donner Pass at Auburn, they hit a tree. Now, exactly why there was a tree out in the tracks and foul of the locomotive is yet to be determined. We'll figure that out as we go. But the problem is when they hit the tree, they broke the cylinder cocks, which sort of begs the question, what in the world are the cylinder cocks, and why did they have to completely come to a stop until they got them repaired? Well, these valves down here are the cylinder cocks or cylinder drains. And their function is that when the locomotive's been standing for any length of time, water will build up in the cylinder, and you've got to drain that water out before proceeding, or the train's going to do something called hydrolocking. Hydrolocking is when water in the cylinders is compressed by the piston moving forward or backward. If there's steam or any kind of gases in there, that's compressible, and that'll run through the system quite normally. But water is not compressible, so as the piston comes forward or backward and it encounters water and attempts to pressurize the water, instead it will just jam the entire mechanism and probably break something. So it's imperative to drain that water out as you're moving forward if the locomotive's been sitting for even just half a minute or so. So the locomotive engineer will open a valve inside the cab that opens all of the drains. On the Big Boy here, there's 8 different drains, one at the front and one at the back of each of the 4 cylinders. This, of course, also releases steam out of the cylinder, but that is what helps propel the water out of there and ensure that there's no water present in the cylinder before attempting to move the locomotive. And the valves are left open for a reasonable amount of time to ensure that there's no water present in the cylinder. Probably half a minute. I've seen them left open for as long as 1 minute upon starting up the locomotive. And then these valves will be closed down to save steam, of course. When I was on the Ken Burns film with Dan Markoff and the Eureka, the Ken Burns crew insisted that the valve cocks be open all the time, just because they like to look, and it doesn't hurt anything. So in that film, if you look at it, the series on the Old West, whenever the Eureka comes by, the cylinder cocks are open, even if it's just out on the main line highballing. So here's an interesting photograph showing that function. When you open the valves, you can see a little tiny steam cylinder there that opens the valves. And in this particular case, both valves are draining steam because of the position of the piston in the cylinder, that at that particular moment, both ends of the cylinder are being drained. But all steam locomotives have to have these cylinder drains or cylinder cocks, or you're going to damage the locomotive, and the locomotive engineer has to know when to open them, which is to say every time you're going to start up the locomotive, the first thing you do is you open the cylinder drains to let water out. Here's a fun shot showing the cylinder cocks, the cylinder drains, all the jacketing and insulation and even the cylinder cock linkage is all removed. So you can clearly see these little small valves for draining the cylinder. And here's a lovely schematic showing the position of the drains, and you can see that as the piston moves back and forth in the cylinder, it will force any water toward the drain and out the drain so that it won't hydrolock the locomotive. And here's something that's just sort of fun involving this same system. On the Pikes Peak and Manitou cogwheel railroad, originally they ran this thing on steam, of course, and they still have one operational steam engine, which sometimes they'll run. But what they have here is a very unusual twin-cylinder compound cylinder system, so there's actually 4 complete cylinders here because they need so much power to get up the mountain. But coming down the mountain, they actually intentionally hydrolock the locomotive. So there's actually no coupler here on the locomotive. It simply uses a push bar to push the car up the hill, and then coming down the hill, the locomotive and car are separate from each other, so should the locomotive get away from the car, the brakeman on the car can apply the brakes and stop the car, and the locomotive will just roll down the hill without the car. That's only happened one time in the history of this railroad, and of course it ended up with the locomotive going off a cliff. But the car was okay, and all the passengers were fine because they just stopped. I digress. So what they do here is at the top of the hill, they will intentionally pull water into the cylinders. All of the water for the locomotive is stored in the 2 saddle tanks that are on either side of the boiler. That way the weight of the water is pressing down onto the drive wheels for traction. And then that water is fed into the cylinders at the top of the hill and then returned from the cylinders through drains back up into the saddle tanks. And so the cylinders at that point are really functioning as a water pump, circulating the water between the saddle tanks and the cylinders and back up into the water tank. And then by regulating that flow, it forms an insanely efficient braking system to keep the whole thing from rolling down the steep grade. At that point, the cylinder cocks are opened and all that water drained out, and then it can function as a steam locomotive again. At any rate, they needed to repair the cylinder cocks on the big boy before they could proceed up and over Donner Pass. If you're not a subscriber to the channel, please consider subscribing. Doesn't hurt. And we also have members. If you hit the join button, that sends $5 a month our way. But at the very least, if you're not a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. Zoink! Right there, the subscribe button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet, and we hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.